So the first question I'm going to ask is that do members of the First Nations communities, how do they receive the work that you're doing, Neil? So you're kind of on the ground in that space. First Nations fisheries are not regulated the same way as the rest of the industry, I think is the understanding.
Well, yeah, I mean, RJ could probably speak more to the regulatory aspect. I've worked with on site at Oshawa, which is a First Nations operated facility. I mean, they like it, of course. It provides employment, and it's you know, from what I've seen, I was honestly surprised when I walked into the offices to see how well run it was. It's a very organized operation. It was interesting, you know, I asked about if I could see some records about phosphorus and oxygen concentrations from the previous year, and then just walked over to the you know, wall and pulled out the binder from last year, and it was all organized. And in 30 seconds, it could show me what the water quality data was from the previous year. But I can't speak for the First Nations in general in terms of how they view the operations. RJ, maybe you have.
It sounds like they're open to providing data and working with you though. So the way they're receiving your work is in an open and transparent.
Very much so.
Try to give a quick answer because I'm now not known for that. I can tell you that, again, like Neil, I can't speak on behalf of, and I wouldn't dare generalize across all of Ontario's First Nations, but I do have to say that one thing as an industry that we're very proud of is comparing ourselves with the West Coast, because there are a lot of contentious issues with the First Nations on the West Coast that we just do not have here in Ontario. I would say the reception is quite warm. We actually have a whole sector of folks, CFO, MAFRA, and our own industry that are responding, and through the First Nations funding organization, Wabatech, that are working throughout the province, because we had this huge upsurge in the last couple of years of First Nations communities that want to explore what aquaculture could mean for their communities, whether or not it follows our model of trout or whether or not it's exploring alternative species. I know that I just saw a little slide of workshops that have been had with First Nations communities over the last year, and it's into the dozens. So, cool.
One of the kind of recurring questions that's come up is about the difference between open water, open cage, and closed cage operations. And one of the first questions is kind of an economics one. Can you give us a sense of the economies? Is it less expensive to run an open cage, and is that really the driver here, or are there ways of closed cage?
So, broadly speaking, economically, a land-based flow-through farm compared to a net pen operation in Ontario, a fish, the same rainbow trout that would be pulled out of market size 2.8 to 3 pounds out of a net pen farm is going to cost 3 times more to grow to that size in a land-based operation. In an open water net pen, the densities, the ability for the fish to swim around is so much greater, and the fresh water is so much greater that it's actually the feed conversion ratio is part of that, but also a flow-through operation has a lot of added inputs from labor and electricity and things like that. I can only speak to those two, but I can tell you that a recirculating aquaculture, like a closed containment land-based, is going to be significantly more expensive than one of those flow-through farms.
So James, you probably have some thoughts on that from beyond just the straight cost.
Yeah, definitely. So if you were to put a farm in public waters and provide the water, the dilution capacity for the wastes and biological degradation of everything, if you were to pick it up and put it on land, you're adding the cost of the land, you're adding the cost to move the water to the farm. You're also adding the cost to return that water back to a provincial water quality objective before it can be disposed, the treatment cost. So that starts to take into account the full treatment or the full cost of producing it. The difference between that and net pen is the subsidy, that public subsidy that Ontarians are providing to permit net pen aquaculture.
Are there any reliable technologies that can actually, we're talking about phosphorus and scouring phosphorus. Are there any technologies, maybe James, do you have a?
Yeah, phosphorus removal is something that has certainly been researched quite a bit in the municipal wastewater field. There's coagulation, precipitation, that can get it down to fairly low levels. There's also some other novel technologies that actually try to reclaim it. There's a company in Alberta actually where they use some electrochemical techniques. They try to get the phosphorus back out as a mineral. Again, get it out of the water so we can put it back in the soils. So, but there is reliable treatment, but there's a lot of room for improvement still.
Okay, and again, I think this impacts on something that was put into a tweet or a post that went out on nearshore phosphorus levels versus offshore phosphorus levels. And Neil, maybe just the research, you went through the slide fairly quickly, but the Cisco picking up the nutrients and taking it into the pelagic zone as opposed to the nearshore. Can you maybe just speak a little bit more about that while I pick up my notes?
Yeah, so in any aquatic ecosystem, in any lake, your nearshore nutrient concentrations, just by nature of being in contact with the sediment, you'll probably have higher nutrient levels. The placement, the Depot Harbor study, and Depot Harbor is one site, but in that site, the nutrients, or the energy subsidy at the very least, it was carbon and nitrogen, but that's all packaged together in the organic material with phosphorus, was being detected in open water fish and not your nearshore fish. This year when we did these studies, that was just looking at perch and Cisco. This year we sampled everything we could from the near shore and the offshore. We haven't got those results yet, but the initial study looked like, Depot Harbor or Depot Island is it's a deeper site, but it is kind of closer to the shore. So, but it appeared that things were picking up offshore.
I just wanted to throw in too, I really appreciate you, Jim, bringing up the cloche. That was definitely a big learning lesson, not just for our industry, but also for the government ministries that were part of that project. Something I always like to say is that as an industry, as net pen farm operators in Georgian Bay, it is in our best interest to continue our excellent stewardship of the bay waters. Why? Because A, it's the right thing to do, but also B, if we do put sites in locations like the Cloche that don't have the flushing that are more enclosed, and all the farms that I showed you up there, the green ones, they are in the open waters. There is a stream that's very, very, very different than, say, something like the Cloche. The reason that we want to put our sites out in places like that is because if we do put them in those enclosed spaces, like we learned, quickly the added phosphorus and things like that can cause the oxygen levels to plummet, which cause our feed conversion ratios to soar. And if anybody knows the way around a balance sheet, if your most expensive input, the feed, if you need 2 times as much, all of a sudden it becomes significantly more expensive for the same pound of fish. So just wanted to make sure I highlight that.
There was one question about other things that you measure. Oh, I'm doing it again.
It's my way to find out all the questions.
Yeah, but it's about whether you measured oxygen at Depot Harbor. With the view of the slide that James showed where, in the ice you can see kind of bubbling methane or whatever it is that's coming up out of is there an oxia happening in the Depot Harbor area or not? Were you measuring that? Thanks.
Yeah, so you do get decreased oxygen concentrations directly underneath the pen. We only measured it at one point this summer, just because that piece of equipment is in high demand in our, and what we found is that oxygen concentration increased in anywhere between 70 to 100 meters away from the pen. Your oxygen concentrations were background. So there's a footprint and there's definitely anoxia happening, but at this point it seems to be, you get 100 meters away and then you're at background levels.
So there's an area of impact, or a radius of impact, if you will. Then.
Yes.
When the study that was done in 1999, I think there was a 250 hectare area that was anoxic. The last time we had our scientists on site at GBA was in 2000. And the question I have is it recovered? And I don't know if the MOE can answer that, but that is a very valid question.
And that actually raises a good point, because one of the first things that we did with Guelph when we started to say actually the GBA came to GBF and said, can you guys do something on aquaculture? We need to understand what's going on. And so we then went and said, well, what do we know and what don't we know? And it was just a synthesis of all of the research that occurred, around the world. And I think this has been mentioned a couple of times. There's a lot that we don't understand. And secondly, there were some changes to the way the industry was formulating feed and things like that we don't know if that had a positive impact or a negative impact, basically from an external perspective, right? So I think there is still a lot of research that needs to be done on that scientifically. We have that one.
Could I ask a question?
I'm sure, go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me come in here.
Did you write one down too, Claudia? Just
No, I didn't get a chance to write
So
one down.
if you haven't written that, could you write it so that I can put it to afterwards?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is, you heard from experts this morning on climate change and microplastics, and they projected into the future what all this would mean into the future. We're drinking, we're eating plastics, and climate change is undeniable. With that are the storms, and my understanding of phosphorus is that the storms will kick up the phosphorus that is now contained on the bottoms under the cages. University of Guelph and the Ontario Aquaculture Association, have you projected far enough? If there are any First Nation people here, we know about the 7 generations. Have you projected into the 7th generation, into what this will all mean, this public subsidy of our waters?
And if I can add to that, just before you take an answer on it, if the water temperature is increasing by 4 or 5 degrees, what is that going to do to cold water species? And, does that change growth and things like that too? So there's a lot of climate change impacts that are coming that, need to be considered. Is the industry considering those scientifically? And Jim, if you have anything to add?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say that Claudette expressed one of our greatest concerns, is that this is a complicated system, and it's hard to predict exactly how it's going to emerge in the future. We do know certain facts. Again, high-level systems, phosphorus in the environment tends to stay. Generally, I believe it was accepted amongst the environmental and scientific community that it is a good thing to prevent phosphorus inputs into fresh water. Generally, that's a good thing. The IGC has even sort of stated objectives in terms of what they would like. We've invested a ton of money to take phosphorus out of our wastewater, recognizing there's atmospheric deposition, there's leaf litter, and there's rivers, and there's aquaculture, and there's septic tanks, and there's all these inputs for phosphorus. I think as a society, we have to go back and revisit, do we still want to maintain preventing phosphorus input into a freshwater body is a good thing? And if we all agree that yes, it is, then what can we do collectively to reduce that? Now, aquaculture may have a piece of that. It could be entitled to a piece of it. The sizing, if you put a cage in a closed area and it quickly becomes eutrophic and it becomes unpalatable, you can't swim it or drink it. If you move it in fresh water, then it's acceptable. What that literally means, that siting criteria means, is that you're flushing it away. You're using dilution as the solution, right? And again, we're just going back to that same principle that I thought we'd all agreed was something we wanted to, So I would say that without knowing full certainty, at the high-level systems level, we should move cautiously. And that is why we kind of advocated not to take farms away from existing farmers, but to really slow down and make sure we understand it. And there's just still a bunch of question marks.
Thank you for that. From a phosphorus inputs point of view, I do just want to highlight that it's directly there on Environment and Climate Change Canada's website that the incredibly low phosphorus levels in Lake Huron are what they blame for the decline in wild crayfish stocks since 1972. So I do just want to highlight that although we can look at pictures of Lake Erie and worry that that's going to happen to Lake Huron, we are so far from that wherever the phosphorus is coming from. It is, I've heard it bounce between being called oligotrophic, meaning very nutrient deficient, to ultra-oligotrophic, being extremely nutrient deficient. So that I just want to make sure that Lake Huron Bay, as long as they are in more of the open water like we have with our existing farms, like I said, it's a very different ballgame. The other thing I wanted to highlight too is that the aquaculture licenses for the existing farms are up for renewal in 2020. And we as an industry have lobbied to standardize and greatly increase the standards of those licensing conditions. They are actually following the BAP model, the things that the BAP certification are asking. We are lobbying to inject into those because we want standardized licensing conditions on existing sites and any new sites. And those things include a better sediment modeling, an understanding of the boundaries of where those farms exist. These are things that we are working with Ministry of Natural Resources, with MOE, with the federal DFO researchers to better understand so that we are truly thinking far beyond our returns at the end of the year.
Sorry, I'll just quickly answer your question. No, we haven't done the projections, but the issue is what would we base those projections on? Is it status quo? Is it improvements that we would see? Is it, I think what we need to do is do the research where we show what the variability is among the different operations and where they're placed, how they feed, how they harvest, and what managerial approaches minimize the loss of phosphorus to the sediment. And then we can start to make the projections from that.
So we're now going to be at the end of the time for our discussion. If you haven't had your question, I think I ran through these again. Most of the questions that were asked at the tables have been answered. Is there one last question that hasn't been? Go ahead.
I've got a question from the consumer's perspective. Since you're doing all this research and studying fatty acids and so on and so forth, when I approach a counter at a retail store, I'm looking at two things. I'm looking at farmed and I'm looking at wild. I tend to go to the wild because I don't know what the farms are eating and I don't know then what I'm eating. Would you suggest there's a huge difference between wild and farmed for us consumers?
And organic.
And the third one is organic.
I really wish there was a simple answer to that question. And really the only thing I can direct towards is certifications. So we could talk through several scientific studies that show wild and farm diets. Arguably, as someone who, like I said, fish farming runs in the blood, I have more confidence in what a farmed fish is eating and the inputs to a farmed fish than I do for a wild, and there are lots of studies outside of the freshwater ecosystems to back that up. But the advice that I always have, it's not farm versus wild. It's looking for some sort of certification. The two that I recommend are the Atlantic Stewardship Council or the Marine Stewardship Council, one's wild, one's farm, or the BAP certification, best aquaculture practices.
The other thing I think we found out a couple of years ago when we were talking, and Guelph was talking about the DNA barcoding, and Kevin, is what the fish is labeled as and what it actually is can be completely different things too. And if you do a genetic sample of it, you might find what's labeled as tilapia it actually isn't, or vice versa, right? So, yeah. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just I don't know what I'm getting myself into with this new research program we have, hopefully coming through with Weston, but we have the Aquaculture Stewardship Council and we have, I want to say Oceanwise, is that the West Coast one?
Yes, the Vancouver Aquarium.
Yeah, Vancouver Aquarium, Oceanwise, on that panel to kind of represent consumers on that side as to what's sustainable and what, because they're the ones that put those little stickers on to say, this is sustainable and that type of thing. So we'll see how that all unfolds.
Good. Yep. Bert?
So the GBVR just recently published in their State of the Bay that the phosphorus levels in the great and the open water is significant. I think it was mentioned briefly, is very low, impacting the zooplankton, which is going to have an impact on the fish. You know, so the question is, okay, so if there's phosphorus levels that are too high in the near waters versus the phosphorus levels in the open water is too low, what are the implications of that? Do we understand why the phosphorus levels are too low?
So part of the reason for that is the dry-seated mussels that are down at the bottom are basically causing a dead end in the way that nutrients transport themselves through the system. There's something called the benthic shunt, where the nutrients that get into the bottom waters end up kind of moving up through the food web and into the near shore. And that's actually been stymied by the trillions of actual quagga mussels that are down at the bottom of the lake now. So that's, I think, on the offshore, the suspected mechanism for phosphorus sequestration out there. That isn't occurring in the near shore, and somebody mentioned in their experience of the water, I think, James, it was you, getting your feet all cut up from the zebra mussels. The zebra mussels need hard rock in order to adhere to them. The quagga mussels that look similar, but they don't need the hard rock. And they can go into the muck and the sands in the bottom, and they can also live a lot deeper. Where the zebra mussels are kind of in the top 70 meters, the quagga mussels can go down 200 meters. So if you look at the bottom of the lakes right now, there's way more mussels than you've ever seen that used to be on the rocks of the shore, but they're just down in the bottom of the lake now. And the quagga mussels have outcompeted the zebra mussels for all of those nutrients. And if anybody's heard Runas Liskauskas from the M&R's Upper Great Lakes Unit talk at any of these kinds of events, Runas has described the offshore waters of Georgian Bay right now as a biological desert. The diparia, the little kind of crustacean that feeds the shrimp, doesn't have any food. The zebra mussels and the quagga mussels have filtered it all out, and that's causing real kind of difficulties out there. So the other thing I'll just plug for is some First Nations traditional environmental knowledge piece. The Chippewa of Nawash First Nation shared a long time ago, back in about 2012, when the IJC was going around with the Upper Great Lakes study, that their elders remember a time when the lake level in the bay would actually rise because the lake trout were chasing the herring in, and all of that biomass coming into the water would actually cause the water to bulge. And they remember when the sturgeon were eating cranberries off of the bushes along the shore. Just a totally different way of looking at Georgian Bay. We are now looking at, from a biomass perspective out there, about 1% of the fish that used to be in Georgian Bay. So we have a lot of work to do, and there's a lot of productivity that could go on out there. One of the other questions was things like that. How do native trout and escapees that come out of the facilities, how do they compete? What are the interactions there? We'll continue to try to answer those questions and provide some more articles and posts and things like that and get the information out. If you haven't had your question answered, as I said, feel free to email us. You can email me. My email address is real easy, ed for executive director @gbf.org. Just send your questions and we'll endeavor to kind of go out and answer those. But thank you very much to the panel today. Thank you.